In Fortunati's cybernetic framing, she
Mm,
treats the household as a system of recursive sort of loops, right? Command,
mm-hmm,
feedback,
mm-hmm,
breakdown. Whereas
mm-hmm.
like Dalla Costa's social factory thesis draws the household into sort of a different terrain of production, into the terrain of production, I should say. When we look at the picture of domestic labor, that emerges during this time period. What is your understanding of how it's understood?
Right. Well, I actually, I think you can make an interesting kind of historically specific argument about that, right? That has to do with Italy and has to do with the fact that, like in many of with the new mass worker, right, which is what precedes the social worker or the operaio sociale, um,
Yeah.
there is, there's still piecework, a piecework system, right? That's really brutalizing and grinding. And if you read like Nani Balestrini's, Vogliamo Tutto or something that describes this migratory workforce, the immigrant workforce, working in the great industrial citadels of the North, they will literally bring home all the engine parts and freaking the entire family will assemble it on the table, right? And there's a lot, and then there's also, because most people come from agrarian backgrounds, there's also small scale farming and kind of like cottage production, right? I mean, there's sort of overlapping modes of production. It's like I think women literally are, even if they're not formally employed, and even if their relation to capital isn't directly mediated by the wage, they're selling things, they're making things, they're doing things in the house, right?
Yeah.
Um, but then, yes, you can certainly track that. Well, and if they're living in Mestre, for example, where Della Costa is doing her original research, and their husbands are literally being poisoned by petrochemicals and they're coming home covered in this stuff, then the house is the site of production, right? I mean, there's a very like literal way in which to try to make a break between the public and private is,
Yeah.
absurd. And you don't even need the kind of, brilliant like interventions of like U.S. feminism at the time, which break down the personal and political. There's something a little, well, yeah. I mean, you do still need that. I mean, that was an important part. They had a reception of the most radical elements of U.S. feminism, and those are all translated into Italian in the early '70s. But so I don't want to I
That's
don't want to
interesting.
discount the internationalism. I mean, Maud Braca has an extremely good book. She may be the best, the most thoroughgoing historian in English, just of the internationalism of the Wages for Housework movement and of the different feminist movements in Italy in relation to international movements. But yeah, I mean, but then yes, as we chart Fortunati's work going forward, um, oh, also even before that, as to your question about cybernetics, it's really interesting because, a lot of Feminista is founded in 1971, right? And the Club of Rome's Limits of Growth comes out in 1972. Basically the same time, just as this feminist movement is getting off the ground, there is this early application of a kind of cybernetic logic of feedback loops in analysis of so-called global sustainability, right? And of course, so they're always extraordinarily suspicious of logics of sustainability, and the way that Della Costa herself has to come to a kind of feminist ecology sort of has to like pass over that in a really interesting way, because they recognize, and I think they're maybe getting this from Black feminism in the U.S., from the welfare rights movement in the U.S., and from maybe radical groups from Puerto Rico. But they're acutely aware of like the eugenics programs that are already underway in Puerto Rico and California, in the post-war era. And under Indira Gandhi in India and the Green Revolution. And there's this real, so this application of like planning of reproduction and disciplining of reproduction by the state acting as a representative of global capital is very much a part of the early discourse. And so they'll say,
Mhm.
the state needs us to have babies when it wants us to, right? Which we obviously see today in these ridiculous like neo-fascist pro-maternity initiatives that have been fairly global, right? I mean, they've been in Erdogan's Hungary, they've been in Putin's Russia, they've been in Trump's U.S. And elsewhere, of course. And then it wants us to be sterilized, or it wants us, to restrict our growth in the name of sustainability. Whenever it doesn't need a workforce, or whenever a workforce risks becoming too problematic, right? When American blacks in the northern cities, a vanguard of agitation in workplaces and simply on a community level, they, they're all of a sudden a pariah and a menace, right, to the reproduction of the state. So they're very savvy about that kind of introduction of cybernetics or cybernetic logic. I mean, the mathematics and I think the limits of growth have been more roundly critiqued and turned out to be, largely quackish. And I'm not sure what they would say about the contemporary manifestations. Discourses of sustainability now, I think, have a different kind of political constitution, which is important to study. So it's not like they would wholesale dismiss any. But sorry, to answer the second part of your question, which was about Fortunati, because she does become a theorist of she does become a theorist of media and media use, I think with the sort of Web 2.0 era, when the internet is embodied or attached to the body, right, and circulates through the household in the form of durable commodities, automobiles, refrigerators, cell phones, etc. She does see this as a kind of expansion of reproductive labor and a more direct, in fact, extraction of value, from reproduction that wouldn't require mediation of the wage, because we have to work to check out our groceries. There's no more cashier. Certain labor is decommodified, right? We have to do our own banking online. We have to sign up for social services on the internet, right? There's all this work that is, saved to industry and to the state. And then there's the extraction of value that comes through so-called data mining, which of course is not a term she would use, because, there have been so many good popular and scholarly critiques of that term. We understand it as data production, or the production of a particular kind of commodity, which has carceral uses, which has commodity uses, which has, population control uses, right? Yeah.
So one thing I see in all three scholars' works, right, like Federici, Fortunati, and then is all three reject essentialist ideas of what a woman is. And instead, they theorize reproductive subjects through their role, relation, and struggle. And what does that approach towards reproduction as a process of political composition mean in the broader context of this movement and their contribution to radical thought?
Yeah, well, I mean, I tend to think there still really is, something quite valuable in exploring, the particular legacies and articulations of this sort of operaist feminism. That can, I say operaist because I think you can also find that kind of core of co-research and potential struggle, right, rooted in operaismo to a certain degree. There's a wonderful new book that's just been translated into English by Gigi Rogero, which talks a lot about what co-research really meant in the in Alquati, in Montaldi, in the early radical sociology. And he actually does a lot of work with a wonderful feminist scholar, Anna Curcio, who sort of continues, I think, this practice in her own research into organizing in warehouses, organizing within the networks, the expanded and, you could say cybernetically administered networks of global capital. But I think what I wanted to say specifically here was that, yes, there's of course not an essentialist conception of women or femininity. There's a I think there's a really interesting play, right, between the practical and the utopian plane in terms of demands. I think that's what always sort of frustrates people still to this day about a demand like wages for housework, and people like get all angry by it, because they don't know what it means. Does it just mean a better welfare state? Does it mean the absolute abolition of the wage? And there is this great operaist tradition, I think, which becomes even better in its feminist articulation. Where the political as a kind of semi-autonomous realm has to precisely mediate this problem. So I don't know, I don't know that it's a utopian claim. I don't know that it is a reformist claim. I know that it's a provocative one, right? And sometimes they would refuse to answer the question, well, what do you mean? How do you actually realize wages for housework? They would say, well, if we have the capacity to build this demand, then we have the capacity to transform everything, right? Which is a good answer, kind of a cop out, right? Other times they would make more, they would make more concrete proposals. They would say, we're going to protect the family allowance in England. We're going to counter the destruction of the welfare state in the U.S. We're going to, fight for a whole variety of causes that might resonate with this kind of reclamation of reproduction as a site of resistance. It's also about not proposing a positive figure, right? And that has to do with what I think you're touching on in the anti-essentialism, right? Because to say we are all house workers, you can understand how at the time that was sort of hard for a lot of the feminist movement to get behind because, in Betty Friedan's say, housework is precisely the frustrating, endless tedium that one wants to escape and, therefore should be eschewed at all costs. And, to say that you're organizing, as a housewife and that you still in some fashion do housework regardless of your sort of visibility, your prestige visibility, your other accomplishments is and perhaps be felt as demeaning, understandably, right? But still it's maybe what's necessary, right, is to not have a kind of positive political figure because we know how like wretched and violent those can be, and that's precisely what some of what the both Aparismo and then Lotta Feminista are rebelling against. Jacopo Galimberti has a good book about the artworks of it touches on some of the artworks made by Lotta Feminista, but he points out there are these representations of maternity that are very prevalent in the Communist Party that look pretty much like the fascist representations of maternity for all intents and purposes. I mean, it's a kind of consistent socialist realism. I mean, I think the notion of like the perfect revolutionary subject or the perfect political subject that's worthy of our recognition and respect is obviously particularly pernicious today. I've been reading that wonderful book by what is his name, Mohammed El Kurd, I think, the Perfect Victims. About how Palestinians have always been uh, have been constantly demanded to be children, basically, to be children who are bombed without resistance, who are endlessly tolerant of violence, who have no sense of history of politics, who are pure innocents. Not that these are, equatable at all, right? These are very different political contexts and histories. But I do think that there's something about like needing a positive political figure that is always a defeatist and always sort of wraps you into a politics of recognition that risks reproducing capitalist relations, right?
In terms of the wages discussion,
Yeah.
and their work, love is treated kind of ambivalently. It's used to sort of, one could, some people, as you were mentioning before, kind of, this like, are they moralizing labor or obscuring dependencies? I know that Federici later claimed that it was something that we had to redefine or like rework, in a radical sense. What tensions do you see in how they approach the politics of love?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. There's well, there's a great text by actually Mariarosa Dalla Costa's sister, Giovanna Franca Dalla Costa, called The Labors of Love, that I think was translated by Enda Brophy, if I remember, who's actually this wonderful media theorist, who at least early on in his career wrote a lot about wages for housework, and I think was influenced by autonomous feminism and Fortunati's work. So I would say, yeah, there is really, from the earliest text, there's this kind of like negative dialectic between compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory work, right? If you remember, there's this great line in Federici's Wages Against Housework where she writes, like, we must call work what is work. And she's describing why sexuality itself can become work, right? And she says we must call work what is work, so we might discover love which we have never known, right? So
I'm going to write that down.
yeah. It's a beautiful line. I think I'm paraphrasing it. I'm probably not quoting it precisely, but I can send you the quote. And Kathy Weeks actually takes this up, I think, in her book that really did a lot to rediscover the wages for housework movement as a kind of road not taken, your horizon of second wave feminism, if you use the wave system, the problem with work. But she says, Marxism has often been accused of being an essentialism of work. And, this accusation was made especially intensively against this movement, right? Because how can sexuality itself be work, right? But of course, the thing is, of course it can be work, right? We all know it can be work, and it has been since time immemorial, right? In the form of sex work. I mean, there's great literature on sex work early on in the movement, and many of the movement members actually, some practiced sex work, both in the Italian and British branches of the movement. So there's some real insight and analysis there. All I was going to say is, I would defend the sort of essentialism of work that runs through some Marxian traditions, right? I mean, because great methodologies often have a need to have a certain vulgarity in their claims, be effective, right? I mean, if psychoanalysis says anything can be sexy, which is unfortunately true of the human, right? I mean, I think this is one powerful insight, right? Is that based on the role of sexuality and gender conditioning in the subject's development, because it sort of happens too early and too late and out of time, anything can be sexualized. Then anything can also be work, right? And you do see that even love, even things done really out of love and care and concern. There's this wonderful new book, I don't know if you've seen Pramila Dawson's new book called Care, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. It has a funny sort of joke Leninist title, but she writes about the way a care economy has sort of blossomed along with war economies, carceral economies, and wild speculation on AI. It's the only thing that's like actually keeping the capitalist class happy in their accumulation, right? Is investing in pharmaceuticals and an aging population, and deriving direct value from illness.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, you see this. It's horribly in the new Trump legislation in the U.S., where they've defunded Medicaid and funded ICE, right? It's a kind of healthcare fascism, but through denial of care and turning care into a profit based industry. I think that element, right, that care work for the work of sexuality. And I'm not being very precise here. I mean, you could, there are actually people who write about the relation between Marxism and psychoanalysis. So I think would do this much more precisely. I'm talking about the way that work can be seen to operate between the two methodologies. I'm thinking of Samo Tomsik, but there are others. Sorry, that's sort of an aside. That's something that really interests me, though. I do think the current state of the economy is and the cultures of neo-fascism, economies of neo-fascism, really make that connection clear, the connection between caring work and exploitation and sexuality, right?
Yeah.
And also, if you just think about it on a, what one of the bad old Marxists, right, would have called, superstructural level, right? If you think about like the intense both misogyny and transphobia of Trump's discourse or of a MAGA discourse, right? I mean, the kind of manosphere podcast culture that wants to have both complete, control over women's bodies, but then the idea that there would be any deviation in the sexuality or in gendered identification is absolutely unpalatable. Trans people must be banned from gender affirming care, from participation in society. Essentially, I mean, honestly, it's a kind of phobia that that amounts to an erasure in the true sense. Like, they're just not supposed to exist, right?
Yeah.
It's really horrifying. Yeah. So there
So
you
I want
see,
to
I think, an economy of
I
sex
want to
and
shift gears for a bit, and I want to discuss groups like Black Women for Wages for
yeah.
Housework and Wages Due Lesbians,
Mm-hmm. Mm,
who
mm-hmm.
developed their own analysis on the question
Mm,
of reproduction, and how did
mm-hmm.
their interventions reshape, the theories that these thinkers were bringing to the fore?
Yeah. Well, so it might be worth actually going back. So these are like semi-autonomous groups or, autonomous groups that form, under the umbrella of the Wages for Housework group. And they primarily form in like New York, Toronto, Philadelphia, London, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. But here I think what's really interesting, right, is that autonomy itself, or um, self-valorization, right, is a term that the Aparisti originally kind of, or Tronti very famously, like borrows from Marx's description of the way that capital works, right? So that, for example, when living labor presents itself on the factory floor, it appears as the self-valorization of capital. um and I think that's like chapter 22 or so. It's sort of paraphrased all throughout A Factory in Society, and where, the part of chapter from Workers and Capital. So originally it's a concept of what can be stolen away from the operations of capital, like for the self-valorization, autovalorizzazione. It's another one of those words that translates very poorly, right? Harry Cleaver himself, who's kind of the coins the term autonomous Marxism, makes this clear that he doesn't like the translation. But so it's what can be wrested away and potentially used as the self development of the proletariat. And when there's a feminist transformation of this in general, of course, it becomes not the factory that expands out into the territory, right? Not that the whole world becomes a factory from a center point, but the potential that life and work be organized from reproduction outward. There's a wonderful early text by Lotta Feminista called The Manifesto of Housewives in the Neighborhood, I think. That's just about this process, right? How to organize. Dalla Costa famously says, and it's even the draft of Potere Femminile, Power of Women, she says, fiat invents the factory first, and then it gives you a canteen or a school attached to the factory, right? And there's certainly certain visions of humane capitalism where, Olivetti will make his typewriter a computer factory and then, try to make it a semi-socialist utopia, right? But the trick is to do the opposite, right? To have social reproduction take the lead, and then production for accumulation become secondary to it. But then, of course, what this means, when it comes to colonized countries, colonized peoples, becomes incredibly different, because if the if the if the housewife, in the great industrial centers of Italy's north, or in London or in New York, has been, if their work has been made invisible and indirectly waged, through the husband's wage, well, in colonial contexts, not only has it maybe been indirectly waged or totally unwaged, or it's performed, in the case of indentured servitude and forms of enslavement, it's performed, reproductive labor is directly performed in the house. So it generally becomes a different set of histories and problems and psychodynamics to think through and work through. And I mean, I think, to their credit, I don't know if it was totally successful, but they were always very good about trying to make space for these groups, and these groups insisted upon it, right? The two, Margaret Prescott and Wilmette Brown, who co-found Black Women for Wages for Housework, are incredible thinkers, theorists, and
Yeah.
Margaret Prescott, especially on wrote a lot about carceral capitalism, sort of before it was popular to do so, right? Like Ruth Wilson Gilmore will actually cite her. Her work was unknown, I think, for a long time, and is getting better known because hopefully I think there are more histories and treatments. But anyway, as was Wilmette Brown is absolutely brilliant. There's a good new book I should mention by Emily Kalachi that's sort of intellectual histories of the members that includes a chapter on Brown and Prescott, which are really able. And I know a couple people who are writing on them. But so I mean, it's just to say that it's what it means to valorize. Yes, what it means to
Okay.
self-valorize. In the context of struggling for autonomy in against racism in the U.S. Or in a colonial context, could be very different and doesn't have the same kind of binary, right, that's assumed between the workplace and the home. So that's, I think, what becomes, but it has a whole racialized hierarchy or a sexualized hierarchy in the case of queer and lesbian sexualities.
You've
Yeah.
returned to these texts, as a translator from a contemporary position. What
Mm.
questions do you ask when revisiting militant writing from a different historical moment?
Mm. Well, I've thought a lot about this, and it's a great question. I'm not sure I have a satisfying answer. There's some irony here, right? In that it's theories of reproduction, and then of course one is engaged in the reproduction of knowledge. To some extent, the reproduction of radical political programs. So there is. I think maybe an understandable but at times unfortunate tendency just to faithfully receive and reproduce, right? Which is of course a huge part of translators or archivists' work, but it can never be done successfully, right? Whether you want to or not. All translation is mistranslation, as they say, to some degree, and requires contextual reframing, a reinvention to some degree. There is no right, like messianic truth that's going to be discovered in the archive.
Yeah.
Right. This is what Derrida says. The archive is always, has a messianic hope. But yeah, there's not going to be a complete political program, right? A perfect, complete political program
And
discovered in the archive. And I think it's very unfortunate when people try to do that. There has to be a reflection and engagement, of course, based on um, changing politics and social political situation. Yeah.
and what editorial or archival projects are you currently working on that you'd like to share? And
Yeah, no, I'm actually, I'm
or if you have any upcoming work that's being published or anything of that.
Yeah, no, I'm doing quite a bit. I'm working actually on an essay for Italian Studies Journal with Maya Gonzalez about some of these early archival documents and about the reception of Lotta Feminista and the relationship with current theories of reproduction and value theory. So this would actually very much touch on one of the questions that you asked earlier, about these whole debates regarding the indirect or direct production of value in what we would call reproductive work or reproductive labor as kind of capacious categories, maybe too capacious sometimes, right? Then there is also I'm working on a piece on gender and money with Leopoldina Fortunati, which is very exciting. I'm translating some of the untranslated chapters of Il Grande Calibano for a publication of those, and I'm at work
That's
on
excellent.
which is a wonderful because it really there's such rich historiography in that book. You know, though it's certainly less polished in ways than Caliban and the Witch, it also, I think, has incredibly powerful reflections on history, accumulation, the transition problem, as it were, right, which are somewhat perennial. And it's much more situated in the Italian context, right? The whole introduction contains sort of direct and indirect arguments with Negri and Tronti about the question of transition, both transition from feudalism, right, but to also the what comes after. And, you know, you have to admit that everyone is writing these beautiful things in the early 80s, you know, in a kind of state of despair because the left has been just in Italy has been dispersed and imprisoned, and you know, capitalist flight and what's euphemistically called, you know, globalization or neoliberalism are in full swing. So it's a very interesting time for Marxian and kind of radical left historiography, I think. So that's fun. I'm also working on a project with minor compositions on a translation, an interview, and little essay introducing the final issue of Operaio della Casa, which was the Journal of Lotta Feminista. They published this wonderful issue called Mille fiori spocciano appassiti. It means 1,000 withered flowers bloom. Roughly, it's like a parody of the Maoist slogan. You know, because there's this proliferation of literature that comes out of autonomous groups in the movements of '77 that is just fascinating, and you know, they have a whole invested critique of it that's quite interesting, and he touches on what I'm trying to write about is actually, you know, the concept of need, right, and radical need, which is sort of theorized intensively at the time by both the Apparisti, the autonomists, the you know, those who are more influenced by psychoanalysis, the distinction between desire and instinct, or right,
Thank you.
Beslan and desire. So yeah, it's quite interesting.